Frodo's Greyhaven's departure. The War of the Ring ended in the fires of Mount Doom. The Shire was saved. The 4 hobbits came home. For Sam, Merry, and Pippin, the return held. They settled back into hobbit life, married, raised families, and took on roles in the Shire's leadership. Their names were recorded in the Red Book of Westmarch alongside the great events they had witnessed. By any measure, they returned whole. Frodo did not. He had carried the One Ring for months across Middle-earth. The weight of that burden left marks that ordinary life in the Shire could not reach. He had also been stabbed by a Morgul blade on Weathertop and bitten by Shelob. Tolkien's appendices record that Frodo never fully recovered from those wounds. Each year, on the anniversaries of those injuries, the pain returned. He spent a few quiet years in Bag End. He wrote. He set down the account that would become the Red Book. But the Shire, unchanged and unhurried around him, no longer fit the shape of what he had become. In the year 3021 of the Third Age, Frodo rode to the Grey Havens on the western coast of Middle-earth. Gandalf was there. So were Galadriel, Elrond, and Bilbo, each a ring-bearer in their own right. Together, they boarded a white ship. Sam stood on the shore and watched it go. Frodo passed into the west. He did not die on the shore. He did not die in the Shire. Tolkien records his departure as a passage granted to a ring-bearer who had been too deeply marked by his burden to remain. What followed after that crossing, Tolkien did not record. Sam returned home to Bag End alone. Elves fade from Middle-earth. The One Ring was gone. For most of Middle-earth, that meant victory. For the elves, it meant something else entirely. The 3 elven rings, Narya, Nenya, and Vilya, had been created in the Second Age by Celebrimbor, separately from Sauron's influence. But Tolkien was clear on one point. When the One Ring was forged, its destruction would undo the power running through all the others. The 3 had preserved Rivendell and Lothlorien for centuries, slowing decay, holding back time. The moment the ring fell into the fires of Mount Doom, that preservation ended. Lothlorien began to fade. The Malern trees that Galadriel had sustained through Nenya lost their keeper. Rivendell, the refuge Elrond had maintained since the Second Age, could no longer be held. The elves who remained in Middle-earth faced a choice Tolkien describes plainly in the appendices: sail west to Valinor, or remain and diminish. Most of the great elves had already made their decision before the war ended. Galadriel, one of the oldest and most powerful elves remaining in Middle-earth, departed from the Grey Havens in the year 3021 of the Third Age, alongside Gandalf, Elrond, and the Ring-bearers. She had been in Middle-earth since the First Age. She did not return. Elrond sailed with her. His daughter Arwen had chosen mortality, and that choice was permanent and recorded as such in the appendices. Legolas remained for a time, fighting alongside Gimli and Aragorn in the early years of the Fourth Age. He eventually built a ship and sailed west from the mouths of the Anduin. He brought Gimli with him, the only dwarf recorded to have made that crossing. Those elves who remained behind grew quieter, fewer, and further from the affairs of men. Dwarves, after Sauron's fall, the War of the Ring left the dwarves in a complicated position. They had fought. They had lost kin. And when it was over, they were still standing. But the world they stood in was changing around them. Gimli, son of Glóin, had marched with the Fellowship and fought at Helm's Deep, Minas Tirith, and the Black Gate. When the war ended, he did not return immediately to Erebor. He led a colony of dwarves south to the glittering caves of Aglarond, the cavern system beneath Helm's Deep that he had glimpsed during the battle there. Tolkien's appendices record that Gimli became the first lord of the Glittering Caves, establishing a new dwarvish settlement in the west of Rohan. Erebor, the Lonely Mountain, continued under its own line. The kingdom under the mountain had been restored decades before the War of the Ring, and remained intact after it. Trade routes with Dale and the surrounding lands of men carried on into the Fourth Age. But Moria, Khazad-dûm, the greatest dwarvish kingdom ever built, was not reclaimed. The Balrog that had driven the dwarves from their ancestral home was destroyed by Gandalf in the year 3019. The obstacle was gone. Yet Tolkien's appendices record no successful resettlement of Moria during the Fourth Age. The halls that had once housed the largest dwarvish civilization in Middle-earth remained empty. As the Fourth Age progressed, men expanded across the continent. The dwarves grew fewer. Their great moments, the forging, the mining, the battles, belonged increasingly to a previous era. Tolkien notes in the appendices covering Durin's folk that the dwarves diminished steadily. Their ultimate fate, he acknowledged, was a matter of tradition rather than recorded history. Aragorn's reign and end. Aragorn was crowned King Elisar in Minas Tirith in the year 3019 of the Third Age. He was the heir of Isildur and the legitimate claimant to the thrones of both Gondor and Arnor. The crowning ended nearly 1,000 years without a king in Gondor. He reunited the two kingdoms into what the appendices call the Reunited Kingdom. In the same year, he married Arwen, daughter of Elrond. Arwen had chosen mortality, a choice that was permanent and recorded as irrevocable in Tolkien's appendices. By making it, she gave up her place on the ship that carried her father west from the Grey Havens. Aragorn ruled for 120 years. Tolkien's appendices record his reign as one of peace and restoration. He extended the borders of Gondor, worked alongside Éomer of Rohan, and maintained close ties with the Shire through his friendships with the hobbits. The early Fourth Age, under his rule, was a period of rebuilding rather than conflict. In the year 120 of the Fourth Age, Aragorn made a decision. He went to the House of the Kings in Minas Tirith, lay down on the burial bed prepared there, and relinquished his life. Tolkien records this as a deliberate act in the tradition of the Númenórean kings of old, before that lineage had been corrupted, men who chose the moment of their death rather than waiting for age to take them. Arwen was present. When Aragorn died, she left Minas Tirith. She traveled alone to Lothlórien, which by then was empty and fading. Tolkien's appendices record that she died there the following winter, in the year 121 of the Fourth Age. Ents without a future. The Ents won at Isengard. On the night Merry and Pippin brought word of Saruman's betrayal, Treebeard called an Ent Moot, a gathering of Ents that lasted 3 days. When it ended, the decision was made. The Ents marched on Isengard, broke its gates, tore down its walls, and flooded its pits. Saruman's industrial fortress was dismantled by the oldest living creatures in Middle-earth. What had taken men and machinery years to build, the Ents destroyed in a single night. Afterward, the Ents established a new forest around the ruins, the Watchwood, and took up the role of guardians over what remained. From the outside, it looked like restoration. A people had reclaimed their purpose. But there was a problem that the victory at Isengard did not solve. The Entwives were gone. They had left long before the War of the Ring, drawn away from the great forests toward the open lands and cultivated fields further east. War and ruin had swept through those lands in the Second and Third Ages. No confirmed account of the Entwives survived. Treebeard himself, in conversation with Merry and Pippin, recorded in Tolkien's text, states plainly that he does not know where they are, and that he fears they may be gone entirely. Without the Entwives, there could be no Entings. No young Ents had been seen in an age. Tolkien addressed this directly in his letters. In letter 144, he confirmed that the Entwives were not found during the events of the story. He left their fate permanently unresolved and indicated he did not intend to resolve it. The Ents continued as guardians of the Watchwood, but they were a people already counting down, whether they knew it or not. 5 wizards, 5 fates. 5 wizards were sent to Middle-earth. They were Maiar, ancient spirits, given physical form, and dispatched by the Valar with a single purpose, to assist the free peoples in their resistance against Sauron. They were not sent to dominate or to replace him with their own power. They were sent to encourage, to counsel, and to help others find the strength to resist. When Sauron fell, that mission was complete. What happened to each of them after that point is one of the more uneven records in Tolkien's writings. Gandalf had carried Narya, one of the 3 elven rings. When the one ring was destroyed, and Narya's power faded with it, his work was finished. He sailed from the Grey Havens in the year 3021 of the Third Age, alongside Galadriel, Elrond, and the Ring-Bearers. Tolkien's appendices record his departure plainly. Saruman did not make it to the end of the war. He was killed at the Shire by his own servant Grima Wormtongue, who cut his throat at the gate of Bag End in the year 3019. His body lay where it fell. Tolkien records that a grey mist rose from it and dissolved on the wind when it turned west and found no welcome there. Radagast's fate after the war is not recorded in any published text. He disappears from the account entirely. The 2 blue wizards, identified in unfinished tales as Alatar and Palando, and in later writings as Morinatar and Romistamo, traveled into the far east of Middle-earth in the Second Age and did not return west. Tolkien's own notes conflict on their outcome. In one account, recorded in Unfinished Tales, he wrote that they likely strayed from their purpose and founded cults. In a later note published in Peoples of Middle-earth, he suggested they may instead have aided resistance against Sauron in the east. Sauron's armies collapse. At the Black Gate, the army of the West was outnumbered. Aragorn had led every soldier Gondor and Rohan could spare to the gates of Mordor, a force of roughly 6,000 men, with no realistic expectation of breaking through. The strategy was not conquest. It was distraction. Every eye in Mordor needed to be fixed on that gate while Frodo carried the ring to Mount Doom. The armies of Sauron that poured out to meet them were vastly larger. Orcs, Easterlings, and Haradrim surrounded the host of the West on all sides. By any conventional measure, the battle was already decided. Then the ring fell into the fire. Tolkien's account in The Return of the King describes what followed in immediate observable terms. Sauron's power vanished. The Nazgul, whose existence was bound entirely to that power, were destroyed in the same moment, swept away as the shadow over Mordor collapsed. The orcs at the Black Gate stopped. Some fled. Some stood confused. The organized resistance dissolved without the will that had been directing it. The battle did not end with a charge or a killing blow. It ended with an absence. Mordor itself began to come apart. The towers of the Black Gate fell. The ground cracked. The armies that had surrounded the host of the West scattered in multiple directions, leaderless and purposeless. Tolkien is clear in both the main text and his letters that orcs did not cease to exist after Sauron's fall. They survived, diminished, disorganized, and driven into mountains and dark places across Middle-earth. The structures of command that had made them a coordinated threat were gone, but the creatures themselves remained a presence in the early Fourth Age. They had not been defeated. The thing commanding them had simply stopped. Sauron's final dispersal. Sauron had survived destruction before. At the end of the Second Age, when Isildur cut the one ring from his hand on the slopes of Mount Doom, Sauron's physical form was destroyed. He lost the ability to take a fair shape from that point forward, but the ring still existed, and as long as it existed, so did he. Over the following centuries, he rebuilt his presence in Middle-earth, slowly and without a body at first, then with growing power as the Third Age advanced. By the time of the War of the Ring, he had reconstituted himself sufficiently to direct armies, bend other minds to his will, and extend his influence across an entire continent. That history matters, because it establishes what the destruction of the ring actually meant. Tolkien addresses this directly in Letter 131, one of the most detailed explanations he wrote about the mechanics of his own world. When Sauron poured his power and will into the One Ring during its forging, he bound a decisive portion of himself into the object. The ring was not merely a tool he used. It contained him in a meaningful and permanent sense. When the ring was unmade in the fires of Mount Doom, that portion of his being was destroyed with it. Tolkien records that Sauron's spirit rose briefly as a shadow over Mordor following the ring's destruction. Vast, but already without substance. Then it dispersed on the wind. Unlike every previous defeat, there was nothing left to reconstitute from. The vessel that had carried his concentrated power was gone. Tolkien states plainly that Sauron was reduced to a permanently powerless state, unable to take form, unable to influence events, unable to rebuild. The shadow thinned. Then it was gone.